Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in comparative literature. Today, we're taking a pretty sharp turn. We have been diving into really important texts like Anna Karenina, The Awakening by Kate Chopin, which are works that are asking very important questions about sex, about desire, about women. And now we are shifting gears. Now we are diving into Cormac McCarthy. I'm not exactly sure what made me go back to No Country for Old Men. I honestly feel like I was so immersed in this world of writing by women and trying to really dig into some feminist questions that I felt like I really needed a counterpoint. The thing that I was struck by most when I dove back into No Country for Old Men was simply the caliber of the prose. So I have read, I think I've read everything. Well, that's not true. I have not read everything by McCarthy, but I have read all of the principal texts. I loved Blood Meridian. That is a book that is challenging, that you really need to prepare for, and you need to really spend your time digging in. I loved the Border trilogy. I cannot get enough of his work. I loved The Passenger and Stella Maris. In fact, there's some lectures on those. That's back when the lectures were a little bit longer. I literally think it's like a 2.5-hour lecture, but I loved digging into those books. When I decided I wanted to go back to his work, I think I chose No Country for Old Men because it is one of these books that stands alone. So does The Road, but honestly, The Road is a book that was an absolute revelation for me in many ways. It was just a book that I was so profoundly moved by. It is also one of these books that I think I will never go back and read again because it was absolutely harrowing. I will also say that this time around, I found No Country for Old Men harrowing. And I think when you sign up for Cormac McCarthy, you are signing up for a little bit of a harrowing experience. And in many ways, I really valued that. But it became very apparent when I first dove in that what I want to talk about today is why he is so, so good. I kept coming back to this idea that he is just an absolute masterclass in practically every single element of prose. So today's lecture is meant to be sort of a primer for all of Cormac McCarthy in the sense that no matter what it is you decide you want to read by him, all of these elements will be there in the prose. And I think if you have an eye toward them, you will have an even better sense of why he is such an absolute genius. This is also a good time to reiterate that there will be no spoilers here. I'm not going to talk about any plot elements really, because again, what we are doing here is really talking about why the prose functions as well as it does. Those of you who like an agenda, here's what's happening today. We're going to talk a little bit about the title of this book, which obviously that is specific to this volume. But I do think it gives us a sense of how absolutely carefully wrought every element of all of his work is. We're then going to talk about these different voices that he inhabits, these different narrative stances. We're going to talk about his description of violence. I mean, I think everyone associates a certain amount of violence with Cormac McCarthy, and I was so struck this time by how well he describes violence. I think people who have read this, or even people who have not read this book yet, have likely seen the movie. And when you think about how those scenes are filmed, how he's depicting, not he, but how the adaptations are depicting violence, it is really interesting to think about how that is written on the page. And for some reason, it really stood out to me this time just how adept he is at describing things that are really harrowing in these terms that are unique, and this approach that's spare but also includes details that are extremely important. It's just, as I said, a masterclass. We're then going to move on to talk about all the ways that he flatters the reader. There is so much very, very detailed information all throughout this book about guns. I am not someone, who's a big gun person. I actually did grow up in a family of hunters. So, I've had guns around me, at least shotguns, for, a good part of my life. But the detailed way that he talks about guns should be absolutely tiresome. And we're going to take a look at the way that instead of being tiresome, instead of making you want to sort of skim through, it is so flattering. So we're going to look at the way that his demonstration of expertise, whether it's guns or the land or any element, the way that he is describing them really demonstrates expertise that could be very obscure, but ultimately ends up being very flattering to the reader. We're then going to talk about minor characters. They are so incredibly well drawn with so much economy, and often it's through dialogue. So when we look at minor characters, we'll also be looking at dialogue. We're then going to look at the sympathy that he derives for his characters, that he elicits in the reader, because some of these people are really bad people, or they're good people who are making very bad decisions. In this case, our protagonist is really drawing a lot of people into this very violent and very difficult situation. And in some ways, we shouldn't have the sympathy for him that we do. So we're going to take a look at the ways that are so effective at making us really feel for these people who are complicated. We're then going to talk about dark humor. This book, I actually noticed more dark humor in this time around, and certainly more, obviously more than in The Road, and I think more than in some of the other works. I don't remember The Passenger and Stella Maris as being particularly funny. And again, when I say humor here, I mean definitely very dark humor, but he's so good at it in this volume. So we're going to take a look at that. And then we're going to close just by looking at some of this just really, really gorgeous prose and why it is that when you enter into any of these worlds created by Cormac McCarthy, there is no denying the fact that this prose is just, I'm thinking of words like world class and nonpareil, like these words that are just like these superlatives for writing, all of which don't really mean anything except, excellent. But I think what's more interesting is to really dig in and try to see why it is, in fact, that the prose is so, so good. So we're going to begin our discussion of the absolute masterclass that is No Country for Old Men with a discussion of the title. This is a title that I think I was kind of misinterpreting for a long time, which is so odd. And I think part of that had to do with the movie. So, and I'm going to be talking a tiny bit about the movie at different points. In the movie, we have the Javier Bardem character who is about the same age, at least in my memory and in sort of the visual impact, as the Tommy Lee Jones character who is the sheriff. So I think when I would think back on this and I would think of No Country for Old Men, which of course is also plural, I would think about both of those people. And Anton Chigurh, who is the just absolutely deranged psychopath, who is really in some ways at the center of the novel, he is someone who is purposefully kind of without country. His last name, Chigurh, his first name Anton, they're definitely, those are not, there's, Chigurh is not a... which it's interesting to say that out loud because, of course, it sounds so much like sugar, which we know that it is meant to be pronounced with an SH sound, with that sibilant sound, sugar, because at one point someone's like sugar, and they're like, no, sugar. So this is a name that is not meant to be tied with any ethnicity. This is someone who has sort of come out of the ether, which makes him especially creepy. So in some ways, I think you can, think of the title as being applied to Anton Chigurh, the psychopath. But in this reading, because I took time to really dig in and look at the title, it really seemed like it applied much more to the sheriff figure, to Ed Tom Bell. So Ed Tom Bell in the book is older. He's about to retire. We get the sense that he's in his 60s, and we get the sense that the other players, and we get the sense maybe that Chigurh is in his 30s or something. It's interesting to me, in some ways, Llewellyn Moss feels very young, like I would have put him in his 20s, but we in fact learn at some point that he is in his 30s. I think maybe his early 30s. Which is a bit surprising. On the one hand, he feels very, old and mature and like he's lived this very difficult, very long life. And maybe one of the reasons he seems very young is because he's married to Carla Jean, who is very young. I think she's 21, and they got married when she was 18. But he is a bit older, and in fact, I think he's not like No Country for Old Men. I don't know. Maybe you could see him as being sort of world weary, and that he and Anton Chigurh and Sheriff Bell are all sort of old in their own ways. But the sheriff is much, much older. And so we have this idea that he is the old man. And this refrain of No Country for Old Men, in my mind, it was kind of like, this is no country for old men. This is like no place for old men. And there is this sense throughout that the sheriff is really picking up on this new evil, this kind of level of evil that is far surpassing the evil that he grew up with, and the sense that his country, the United States, is victim to this new evil. So this time through, I really was relating more to the idea that this applied to the idea of the United States as being in kind of new peril, which we see through the eyes of really one old man who is the sheriff. That interpretation is bolstered by the fact that when I went and looked up the title, it comes from a Yeats poem. So Yeats is one of these, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. He's a modernist poet, but has a lot of romantic poetry overtones. And when I say romantic poetry, I don't mean like love sonnets. I mean the English romantics, who had everything to do actually with death and with the short span of life and with the sublime in the sense of humans as being dwarfed by the majesty of nature. And the poem was written in 1927. It is the first line from a poem called Sailing to Byzantium. And one of the things that these modernist and romantic poets did was to look back to the classic era. So Byzantium is modern-day Turkey. It was an ancient Greek city. So this idea of moving back to the classics was a very big theme that Yeats is really playing on here, this idea of going back to something that provides some sort of antidote to the modern day. So for Yeats, the modern day would have been post-World War I. And that cataclysm was so enormous through Europe that it was, well, I mean, in many, many ways it affected Europe. But one of the ways is you have this modernist writing that comes out of it that really is saying that in the face of this horror that was World War I, we need to find an entirely new way to write novels and to write poetry. So Yeats is talking in Sailing to Byzantium about this idea of going backward in time. And the line is, "This is no country for old men." Then he goes on and talks about old age. It actually made me laugh because Yeats, at this point when he was writing it, he was, struggling with his old, ancient self. And he was literally 60 or 61 when he was writing this, which to me sounds so, so young. But we have this idea here of really dealing with the idea of the short span of human life and aging. And all of that definitely applies to Ed Tom Bell more than it applies to any other character in the book. So this is a somewhat long analysis of the title, but I think it's worthwhile because McCarthy is obviously the type of writer who is putting in incredible amounts of thought, and everything is very purposeful. We just finished reading Anna Karenina. I think Tolstoy, this is blasphemy in a lot of literary circles, but, if you're going to write 1,000 pages, you're going to have some spots that aren't quite as tight as others. And I spoke in that lecture about the way that Anna Karenina and War and Peace, for me, leave it to me to be, criticizing Leo Tolstoy. But those titles, I think, are a bit misleading in the sense that they focus our attention on one element of the novel and make us sort of, miss some of the other really important pieces. In this case, honestly, the title is doing the opposite of that in a beautiful way. We have No Country for Old Men in my argument here, sort of applying to Anton Sugar. And I think we could also talk about how it is applying also for Llewellyn Moss. I'm doing this off the top of my head, but this is someone who came back from Vietnam. That his service in Vietnam and the fact that he was a sniper in Vietnam is hugely important throughout the book. It's not spoken very often. We don't have lots of allusions to it, but it is one of these foundational facts. So this idea of having gone and fought a war that was highly controversial in a country that was obviously very different from the United States, and then coming back to a country that maybe wasn't accepting him for having done this great service, speaks to the complexity of No Country for Old Men, even, for the younger man, but certainly No Country for Ed Tom Bell. So we're going to move on from our discussion of the title and dive into the text. The first thing that we are going to look at is an element that jumps out at us right away, which are these different narrative voices. You don't really know it on page 3 because obviously this is the first page of the book, so you don't have anything to compare it to. But we do have a tip-off, which is that the very first passage, the first entire chapter here, is in italics. So if a book is jumping in italics, if you are a careful reader, you should question yourself a little bit, probably the whole book is not going to be in italics. Italics are used to set something off from the rest of the text. In this case, we don't know this yet, but this is the voice of Ed Tom Bell, the sheriff. He's speaking in the first person. He actually has a very identifiable kind of verbiage and diction and cadence and confessional tone to these pieces. I think even if they were not in italics, the careful reader would understand that this is sort of a set apart confession in many ways that Ed Tom Bell is making and that McCarthy is including for us. Obviously, McCarthy is the one who is making it, but he is very firmly in the voice of this older man. So I want to take a quick look at just the absolute beauty of this first passage. I sent one boy to the gas chamber at Huntsville, one and only one. My arrest and my testimony. I went up there and visited with him 2 or 3 times. 3 times. The last time was the day of his execution. So we are diving right in with this idea of execution and the idea of one man holding the fate of another in his hands. I mean, the stakes are very, very high. We have a sense here of regret. We have a sense here of someone who is looking back and trying to understand what it is that they have done, in this case, over the lifetime of this law officer. Law officer is not a word, but you know what I mean. We have a sense here of responsibility. We have this fragmented part that says my arrest and my testimony. So this is someone who's fully trying to take responsibility for what have happened in the past. This is also someone who's sort of homing in on the facts when he says, I went up there and visited with him 2 or 3 times, period, 3 times, period. This is someone who's insisting on the truth. This is someone who's really trying to figure out what the facts are. And I think most compellingly, this is this first-person narration that really acts as this very intimate confessional with the reader. So one very basic thing about the first person is that it automatically, this seems very obvious, it automatically establishes an I-you relationship. And whenever we're in the first person, the you is the reader. So it's automatically this very intimate thing between a character and a reader. I think lots of people kind of overlook that, but it is, and certainly in this confessional mode, it's a very intimate way for an author to convey a story. So we have this very intimate, very heartfelt, very contemplative and exacting narration that is very firmly in the voice of this one person. And importantly, right from the beginning, we do realize that the sheriff is trying to sort of parse the idea of evil. He's very concerned with this idea of evil, which honestly is typical of McCarthy in the sense that he always seems to be tackling these gigantic questions. I mean, the nature of evil is really a big one. So immediately following this confessional mode on the part of Sheriff Ed Tom Bell, we move into sort of the principal voice with which McCarthy narrates the text. What is remarkable about this, and here's where the masterclass part comes in, is it's this incredible blend of this omniscient third-person narrator that's actually very specific. This is where we get some of the expertise. We get the idea of a very authoritative, very intelligent, very educated, in some ways very clear narrator that is mixed in with the voice of whichever person we are following at the moment. Okay, we're going to dive in. This is on page 5. Notably, the parts that are narrated in the first person by the sheriff are relatively short, and they're interspersed throughout, and they're all in italics. So in many ways, that is McCarthy throwing the reader a bone, making things fairly clear. One of the things that McCarthy does is not make things super clear for the reader. We will see that in this very next passage. That is kind of a hallmark of his work. This is a novel that makes the reader work a bit. And I will tell you, it is incredibly satisfying. If you're feeling a little bit unmoored and you're like, wait a second, I'm not totally sure who's speaking here, all you have to do is hold on a little bit. And the way that he reveals the speaker is so satisfying. So anyone who's thinking of reading some McCarthy or thinking of reading, one of the more challenging texts, I would recommend just sit tight. If something feels unclear, don't panic. Just kind of wait for this master to mete out more information and help you understand what it is he's up to. So on page 5, we have this. The deputy left Sugar standing in the corner of the office with his hands cuffed behind him while he sat in the swivel chair and took off his hat and put his feet up and called Lamar on the mobile. So one of the things that's happening here at the end, I love reading this stuff out loud because I'm hearing it in a totally different way. So we have this one long sentence. We have something called polysyndeton here, where instead of using commas, he's using a lot of and. He sat in the swivel chair and took off his hat and put his feet up and called Lamar. That is a very poetic device. It's obviously very purposeful here. And what it does is both sort of, this sounds totally counterintuitive, but it's both kind of slowing down what is happening here and also speeding things up. So this enumeration and putting this equal weight on all of these different things is making the reader pay a little more attention, which is kind of slowing things down, but also the enumeration of all of those things, because it's making it more clear, there's this sense of setting the scene relatively quickly. That's the kind of speeding up part. And one quick note, this idea of on the mobile, called Lamar on the mobile, obviously the reader at this point does not know who Lamar is. And on the mobile is a very specific thing. You get the sense that it's language that they would use in the office, the deputy and the sheriff. But here is some of that thing where McCarthy is asking you to trust him. And McCarthy is in fact flattering the reader. He's like, okay, I'm going to trust that you're not going to freak out and be like, who the hell is Lamar? I can't read this book. I don't know who Lamar is. And you actually do need to hang in there because there is a Sheriff Lamar who this deputy is calling. Turns out there's also, of course, the other sheriff, Sheriff Bell, there is a lot of complexity. And I think we need to look at the two of them as, Sheriff Bell is going to retire. Sheriff Bell was the sheriff actually the same time his grandfather was. We have this kind of succession of sheriffs that's very important and very subtle. In the beginning, McCarthy's really serving up both of the sheriffs to us, sort of all at once, which has the potential to be confusing, certainly, and is a little bit unsettling. But that's part of the point of why this is all so good, because when it becomes evident, it's very satisfying. So we have the deputy, calling Lamar, and without any quotation marks and without even like that M dash that they use sometimes, certainly in European literature, a lot of Spanish literature and French literature, we just dive right into what it is that the deputy is saying. It's his voice. So without any kind of delineation, we're going straight from this third person narrator, but then we're moving into what it is that this deputy is actually saying. Just walked in the door. Sheriff, he had some sort of thing on him, like one of those oxygen tanks for emphysema or whatever. Then he had a hose that run down the inside of his sleeve and went up to one of those stun guns like they got at the slaughterhouse. Yes, sir. Well, that's what it looks like. You can see it when you get in. Yes, sir. I got it covered. Yes, sir. So all of that is not, there aren't any new paragraphs. This is all just one paragraph. We get the sense that this is just, the deputy is saying this thing. And what we're doing in part in this section, when we are looking at the narrative voice, is to look at how deftly McCarthy is moving from these different characters. So the voice of the sheriff is very specific. It's elegiac. It's very thoughtful. This is this very spoken, kind of everyday quotidian, information providing language. And it's very much in the voice of the spoken voice of this person. It tells us so much about the deputy. He knows what a stun gun at the slaughterhouse is. He's someone who has been to a slaughterhouse. He's someone who is, not minor. What do you say? He's junior to the sheriff. We know because he's also the deputy. But, there's yes, sir. Yes, sir. He's someone who's trying to please. And I have to say, when he says, I've got it covered, that is a red flag right there that perhaps things are not going to go well for him. So we're going to look at two other instances of the way that this narrative voice functions. So when we have the sections that are dedicated to Llewellyn Moss, who is, arguably the hero of, I think in many ways Sheriff Bell is the hero. But Llewellyn Moss is also this very heroic figure. Again, someone who's making some very bad decisions, and yet we have sympathy for him. We're going to look at that. But I want to look very quickly on page 16 at one of the incredible ways that McCarthy handles the sections that are focused on Llewellyn Moss. So they're very firmly in the third person, which I think is very effective. We are not often like in the head of Llewellyn Moss, who is this young man who's, at the center and sort of driving the plot. We often just have description of what is happening, like what he is doing and what he is seeing. And occasionally there will be like an incursion into his thoughts. But one of the things that McCarthy does so well is he provides the voice of Llewellyn Moss essentially talking to himself. So we have, and it feels like dialogue, and so we hear his voice and there's a slight humor to it. We're going to read this little paragraph so you get a sense, but just focus on how masterfully we are moving from the third person into this first person here in a very clear way. He squatted and steadied his elbows on his knees and with the binoculars swept the rocks at the head of the valley. He sat and crossed his legs and went over the terrain more slowly and then lowered the glasses and just sat. Do not, he said, get your dumbass shot out here. Do not do that. So I love this. It says he said, and again, there are no quotation marks. There's no M dash. It's not set off. It's all part of the same paragraph. So in many ways, we have this artful melding together of the third person and this first person. It's actually second person because it's Llewellyn Moss talking to himself. It's like an imperative. And this is the first time we're like really hearing his voice. And there's something so endearing about the use of dialogue here and the sort of slipping into that voice. Again, it reads, do not, he said, get your dumbass shot out here. Do not do that. So we have the repetition, which, if you're in an MFA program, they'll be like, never, ever repeat, and certainly not in dialogue. Of course, if you're Cormac McCarthy, you can break any rule you want because you will do it very well. There's actually a lot of repetition in dialogue, and it is so much to the credit of McCarthy because it is so effective throughout the whole book. But we have this idea here of self-knowledge, of self-awareness, of self-deprecation. He's calling himself dumbass, like don't get your dumbass shot out here. The fact that it is repeated too, and that he's not using contractions when he says do not get your dumbass shot. It's not don't get your dumbass shot. There is a There's a certain gravitas and a certain, emphasis that adds a little sense of the ominous here. But what's truly amazing is the way that we are mixing together the voice of Llewellyn Moss and the third person. So we're going to finish up this section on narrative voice by looking at another section that has to do with Llewellyn Moss. And it's toward the beginning of the book. It's not going to spoil anything for you. But what's interesting here is that we don't have his voice set off in a thing that's like he said to himself, and it's not sort of a spoken kind of language. But we do have a mixing together of registers of this third person omniscient narrator that's a bit more formal, a bit more serious. And then we have these words. A lot of the word choice really speaks to the kind of language that Llewellyn Moss might use. So we have this melding together. And I want to read it partially because it is just so gorgeous. But as we move through, I'll just very quickly point out words and phrases and syntax that to me seem very much like the one register or the other. The other thing to point out, which you obviously can't see here because you're not looking at the page, is that when there are contractions like don't or can't, there is not an apostrophe. So in many ways, to me, I mean, that's not a formal way to do it. It's not the standard way. So it feels a little bit less educated, or someone who isn't putting a giant premium on grammar. I mean, frankly, I love this. I love the idea of putting this into a language that is more urgent, one that is not, caught up in all of the trappings of grammar and spelling. Okay, so here we are on page 28. Wow, my voice is breaking over here. On page 28, he shoved the .45 into the back of his belt and set off at a trot for the lava ridge. In the distance, he heard a truck start. Lights came on at the top of the rise. He began to run. So even a word like he began to run, that's a little bit formal, it's not archaic, but it's not, usually we would say he started running. We wouldn't say he began to run. There's a certain formality there that we associate with the third person narrator. Moving on. By the time he got to the rocks, the truck was halfway down the caldera, the lights bobbing over the bad ground. So when he uses words that are describing the land, things like caldera, there's so much of that. And I actually really enjoyed a lot of it. This is obviously happening in Texas, but a lot of the terrain and a lot of these Spanish words for the terrain are familiar to someone who is from California. That is one of those parts, those sort of expert things where McCarthy is relying on the reader either to be patient or to pick things up from context clues. Or if you know what a barrial is, or you know what a caldera is, you know what these things are, then you're like, oh my God, I'm so on the inside. I'm really appreciating this incredible prose here by Cormac McCarthy. We also have some language that seems like it's kind of between the two, between this more formal narrator, like lights bobbing over the bad ground. Bad ground, to me, definitely sounds like something that Llewellyn Moss would say. So then we move on. He lay face down with his head between his forearms in the grass and waited. So lie is one of those words that people always get wrong. And it's totally possible that Llewellyn Moss would say, he lay or I lay down. But there is a certain formality here. He lay down. I mean, these things are very subtle, but that is why we are looking at them. Because I think as a reader, because as readers move through McCarthy, I think, you're maybe not picking up on the subtlety of this incredible register shift that we are having in the narrative voice. And when that is, in fact, one of the reasons why the text feels so rich. Okay, moving on. He looked for something to hide behind. No time. So this fragmentation, no time, that feels very much in the voice of Llewellyn. He lay face down with his head between his forearms in the grass and waited. Either they'd seen him or they hadn't. So this is one of those places where the contraction doesn't have the apostrophe, and that to me feels very much in the voice of Llewellyn. He waited. The truck went by. When it was gone, he rose and began to clamber up the slope. So he rose is the kind of like more formal, I would think he would say like I got up. It's a more formal idea. He rose, and then clambered to me sounds like a word that Llewellyn himself would use. We're going to look at one more paragraph here on 28. He lay flattened against the rocks. A spotlight went skittering over the lava and back again. So skittering to me sounds, I mean, these are words that are kind of between the two of them, but it seems because it's more colorful and because it's almost kind of onomatopoeic, but it feels to me like something that really only Llewellyn could provide because he's the one who's feeling what it feels like. I mean, again, obviously it is McCarthy who is, providing all of this but it's like more, it feels like more of a word that would occur to Llewellyn. The truck slowed. He could hear the engine idling, the slow lope of the cam. So, I mean, that is something I don't know, like there's some kind of, I mean, cam is like part of an engine. I know that. I think there's like a number, it's like I don't know. I'm not even going to venture into the idea of what cam might mean, but I think it's kind of like a macho thing. For some reason, I'm thinking of like spoiler, which is, I think, one of those things that like if you have like a little racing car, you know, it has like that little fin thing, that like horizontal thing, so it doesn't like go flying up in the air. But anyway, this idea of the cam, the slow lope of the cam. So that to me is absolutely in the voice of Llewellyn. It feels very specialized, and it feels like the way that he would be thinking about it. And lope, of course, has to do with horseback riding. It is reminding us of the fact that this is someone who is from Texas. And it's really telling us a lot about how he is seeing things. We don't know if he's like a big horseback rider, but we get the sense of kind of this Western ethos that he is referencing here. The slow lope of the cam, big block engine. The spotlight swept over the rocks again. And then we have another instance of the narrator of sort of quoting Llewellyn. So I'm going to read the sentence before and then move right into the voice of Llewellyn. The spotlight swept over the rocks again. It's all right, he said. You need to be put out of your misery. Be the best thing for everybody. So, I mean, again, we have this real self-deprecation. We have a certain amount of resignation here. It's always so interesting when you finish something to go back and look at what is in the beginning. I mean, we have a lot of indications from the beginning that life is very difficult for Llewellyn. It's so satisfying when we have all of the information that has accrued throughout the book to understand how well McCarthy has drawn this character right from the start. It's why I think even, you know, on page 28, we feel very familiar with Llewellyn, which is kind of astonishing because we don't have, I mean, honestly, up until this point, it's been lots of descriptions of like guns and the land and antelope. You know, we're not talking, you know, we're not hearing standard things about Llewellyn Moss's life, but we're gaining so much appreciation for sort of how he feels about himself and how he feels about the land or his situation. It is so deft. Okay, we're now going to go ahead and look at these descriptions of violence. And honestly, I don't think I even need to talk much about it. I can just read it. And what I think is important to pay attention to is just the plain way in which he is describing what is happening. It's funny, you know, I just did a whole series on sex writing, and I hope if you have listened to those, you will remember what I've said every single time, which is the best sex writing is simply writing that just says what is happening. We don't need a lot of metaphor. We don't need a lot of, like, I don't even know, discussing like how things feel. I just never think that that's very effective. You really just want, like, if you just tell the reader what is happening, then the reader will, if it's well done, totally get your message. So the same thing happens here with McCarthy because he is simply describing things, but he is also choosing details that are really important. If anyone out there who is a writer, one of the best things I heard in my MFA program is that when you are writing a scene, and McCarthy is so good at this, the thing that you really want to do, and not overdo, is to provide a detail that the reader wouldn't already be able to provide. So if you were describing a bank robbery, you know, as soon as I say that, you have an image in your mind of what the bank robbery looks like. What the writer needs to do in order to make it really come alive and to be interesting to the reader is they need to add an element that the reader cannot see. So I'm going to point out where McCarthy is doing that well when we look at this description of violence. Notably, this is the very beginning of the book. We have that first confessional part from the sheriff is pages 3 and 4. And on page 5, we have that description of the deputy speaking on the telephone. And then we are dropping very quickly into this scene. Like it literally is halfway down page 5. Sugar squatted and scooted his manacled hands behind him to the back of his knees. In the same motion, he sat and rocked backward and passed the chain under his feet and then stood instantly and effortlessly. I'm just going to say right there, adverbs are the enemy of every writer, except that Cormac McCarthy, again, gets to break all the rules he wants to break because he is so good. I mean, instantly and effortlessly is perfect there. It's perfectly placed. In a lesser writer's hands, it really could feel overwrought and overwritten, but it's just perfect. Also, the deftness and the clarity and the economy that he is using is mirroring perfectly what Sugar is doing. If it looked like a thing he'd practiced many times, it was. He dropped his cuffed hands over the deputy's head and leaped into the air and slammed both knees against the back of the deputy's neck and hauled back on the chain. They went to the floor. The deputy was trying to get his hands inside the chain, but he could not. Sugar laid there, pulling back on the bracelets with his knees between his arms and his face averted. The deputy was flailing wildly, and he'd begun to walk sideways over the floor in a circle, kicking over the wastebasket, kicking the chair across the room. So there is the detail. This, you can imagine, somebody like strangling the deputy with his own handcuffs. That part is, it's somewhat inventive. And certainly this move where he I'm remembering that dance move, where people hold onto one leg and then they zoop the other leg through. Feels kind of like that, but way more violent and terrible. But you have that description, which is very clear and I think very unique. I mean, that's not something that everybody knows how to do. But then what's interesting to me is this idea of him kicking over, that wildly the deputy is kicking. He's moving sideways. He kicks over the waste paper basket, and then he kicks the chair, and the chair moves across the room. Those are the details. I mean, they're not astonishing. It's not like something you could never imagine, but those are the details that really situate the reader in this place. So one of the things that I think is so chilling about all of McCarthy, and certainly throughout this book, is the detachment with which he is describing all of this violence. And it's very important because a lot of the violence is happening at the hands of a guy who is a psychopath, who really is totally divorced and is enormously detached from what he is doing. I mean, I don't know that he's detached, but the sort of passive face, this idea of his face being averted while this is going on. This is someone who is not showing remorse. This is someone who is just systematically wreaking havoc in ways that are kind of unimaginable, but here are made very clear because McCarthy is very good at describing violence. So right across the page, we have another example of this kind of detachment. But here we also have this very cool thing, and I'm happy to be reading this right now, where we are dropping from this omniscient third person kind of more distanced narrator into the voice of this psychopath. So this is very early. We're page 7. I don't think I'm spoiling anything for people. The man stepped away from the vehicle. Sugar could see the doubt come into his eyes at the blood-stained figure before him, but it came too late. He placed his hand on the man's head like a faith healer. The pneumatic hiss and click of the plunger sounded like a door closing. The man slid soundlessly to the ground, a round hole in his forehead from which the blood bubbled and ran down into his eyes, carrying with it his slowly uncoupling world visible to see. So these are the kind of details. I mean, the idea of he placed his hand on the forehead of this guy like a faith healer, I mean, that is a simile, but it is such an incredible counterpoint to what is happening. It's such an effective simile. I mean, he's literally furthest from a faith healer. He's about to kill this man. He is someone who's seemingly devoid of any kind of spiritual anything. It is such a good simile. But that's also, I mean, very economically, he places his hand on his forehead. He's telling us what happens. He's very economically making this incredible simile and then moving on. And the next line is, the pneumatic hiss and click of the plunger sounded like a door closing. Incredible. I mean, we all can imagine that kind of pneumatic hiss, like that, the sound of like an air gun, the sound of like air coming out of a tire or whatever. But then that incredible simile here too, where it sounds like a door closing. This is something, I mean, this experience, of using a stun gun to kill another human being is, I mean, hopefully is so entirely alien to anyone who is reading this book. But then to sort of equate it to the sound of closing the door, because that is such a common experience, we can all get it. It also is doing this incredible thing where it is making this like disgusting, horrific, violent action feel very mundane, which to this Anton Sugar guy, this kind of, I mean, I don't know what he's actually thinking about it, but the detachment with which he is doing all of this stuff, it makes you feel like he's not registering any of this in any real way, that he would register the sound of killing someone the same way that he would register closing the door. The other thing that's incredible about that simile is the idea of closing doors. I mean, a door is closing for this man. His life is ending. So you have it's very economical. It's very spare, but the similes are so, so meaningful. And then we have this thing about the blood coming down and with it, essentially the consciousness of this person. So some of the prose derives its beauty from this kind of mixture of things that are very plain, very almost terse, very economical, together with sentences that are not necessarily very long, but become very lyrical and very sort of expansive and very beautiful in terms of their content. So I'll read that last part again. The blood bubbled and ran down into his eyes, carrying with it his slowly uncoupling world visible to see. Sugar wiped his hands with his handkerchief. I just didn't want you to get blood in the car, he said. Which is so gross, but it tells us everything we need to know about this man. So he's using the first person here. It is Anton Sugar who's speaking. He's also speaking to someone who's dead. So this is like it's just speaking to his detachment and to his like inability to actually communicate. And it's also this absurd, it verges on the dark humor. Like he's like, I just didn't want to get blood in the car, which is so gross and so violent and so terrible. But there is an element to it that is absurd and unexpected. And the fact that this sociopath might be, I don't think he's actually concerned about blood because he's covered with blood himself. He's going to get blood in the car. There's a certain tone of kind of irreverence here that is ending this incredible description and ending the chapter. And we are hearing his voice. And what he is voicing is really underscoring the absolute cold-blooded nature of what is happening. And I will remind you, we are on page 7 here. People, doozy of a book. So we're going to move on to talk about this expertise with which a lot of the characters are speaking and the way that it really flatters the reader. We talked about it a little bit before when we were talking about the cam loping, the loping engine. But I want to take a quick look at the way that this not only flatters the reader, but also tells us so much about the character that is kind of wielding this information that might feel obscure. And oftentimes we don't even end up knowing what it is. But the fact that we are trusted to understand, at least like generally what the thing is, makes us feel very much like we're on the inside, like we share in the expertise. So on page 8, again, this is very, early in the book. It's not spoiling anything. Moss sat with the heels of his boots dug into the volcanic gravel of the ridge and glassed the desert below him with a pair of 12-power German binoculars. His hat pushed back on his head, elbows propped on his knees. The rifle strapped over his shoulder with a harness leather sling was a heavy-barreled .270 on a .98 Mauser action with a laminated stock of maple and walnut. So, right from the start, this idea of the lava, the volcanic gravel of the ridge, that is a very specialized thing. I can't quite imagine what that is. Also, we're not going to get into this because we don't have time, but there are so many instances in the book that I saw this time where we are talking about these very, very old things. We're talking about lava here. Obviously, the last time this earth was lava was, millennia ago. At one point, they're talking about the pictographs of the native peoples who are not there anymore. At one point, they're talking about these troughs that were carved by men, who knows how long ago. All of those references back to things in time that are very brief and sort of interspersed. Not a lot is made of them. All of those are so important because it's speaking to a time that is different from this time that is so violent that Sheriff Bell is really seeing as a departure from what has come before it. So this idea, too, of talking about things that are not even like, they're like prehistorical kind of things, like the lava, it adds a huge amount of gravitas to the text. But then when we have the specialization about the .270 on a .98 Mauser action, I don't know what that means, but I know that we're talking about a gun. That is made very clear. But when the narrator is sharing this information with you, what happens as the reader is you're like, like secretly in your mind, you're like, I don't have any idea what they're talking about. But you also kind of do, because you're like, okay, it's some kind of rifle. And that ultimately feels very flattering. Sometimes you feel like you're learning something. In this case, I'm not that interested. I can't picture what a .270 is, and it doesn't matter to me, and I'm not interested in learning that. But there are times when that kind of information, that expertise, is also feeling good because you're actually learning something. In the beginning, when he talks about he glassed the desert, so what he means, of course, and you know this from context clues, is that he's looking with binoculars across, this vast stretch of land. But even the use of that verb, and again, you know what it is, but you're entering into a world where Llewellyn Moss and his community use the word glassed in this very specific way for this action. We find out much later that he was a sniper in Vietnam. So as we are going back and looking at this, we might surmise that this is language that would have been used in the war, which makes it all the more specific and, in fact, all the more meaningful. If you are someone who happened to have fought in Vietnam, and certainly if you happen to be a sniper and you were familiar with the term glassed, imagine how deeply impactful that would be. So one of the things that goes without saying in the sense of all of this expertise is that, wow, does McCarthy end up seeming like a really smart guy? I mean, I remember in The Road, there's a lot of stuff about, nuclear fallout and sort of post-apocalyptic stuff that really spoke to, frankly, a lot of research. And this level of detail, the granularity of this kind of stuff, I mean, I think he has some experience, I would imagine, with a lot of this stuff. He spent a lot of time in New Mexico. He probably knows what a lot of this terrain feels and looks like. But it really adds a richness to a novel that is very spare in lots of ways. The details that we are provided are hugely important. Also, when we have the expertise and it is situated in the world of one person, it can really change our sense of that person. And one of the things that it does here with Llewellyn Moss is it speaks to his intelligence. So just a little further down on that same page, on page 8, the rifle would shoot half-minute of angle groups. 5-inch groups at 1,000 yards. The spot he'd picked to shoot from lay just below a long talus of lava scree, and it would put him well within that distance. I mean, you can imagine kind of what this is. Part of me, you may have thought I read that first sentence wrong. It says, the rifle would shoot half-minute of angle groups. It seems to me like there is a verb missing there. I don't think there is, but this language is so specified that because we are so close to the mind and the actions of Llewellyn, we understand that this is what he is thinking, and the fact that he has this information and that apparently he is very good at his job, because he's the one who holds the expertise, he is elevated in our esteem. Then if we go right across to page 9, I love this because then we have a little bit of the dark humor I was talking about, although not too dark at this point, which is excellent. It's also important to note that he is looking for antelope. He's hunting. And this whole time he has been looking at this herd of antelope. So it reads this on page 9. He wallowed down in the scree and pulled off one boot and laid it over the rocks and lowered the forearm of the rifle down onto the leather and pushed off the safety with his thumb and sighted through the scope. They stood with their heads up, all of them, looking at him, which I just thought was so funny. I mean, there's all of this really important, very serious discussion of, the minute and the blah, 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 and the sight and the scope and the glassing. And then he finally is looking through the scope and all of the antelope, to an antelope, are just staring right at him. This is a very kind of gentle humor, and I just loved it. I think we can also we could really dive deep here into the idea of people who, and, in terms of the antelope, the idea of a herd and the idea of being protected and the idea of things and the idea of being aware of danger that is very far away. All of these things are important. Any details that McCarthy is working into the novel are going to be working on many, many different levels. So we're going to move on to look at these incredibly well-drawn minor characters. We're just going to look at a few of them. They all happen to be women. Again, the women in this book are very important. They're sort of shadowy in some ways, but they are really the foundation. They are the motivation. They're the reason why the stakes feel very high, because these are men who are truly in love with these women, which honestly stands in stark contrast to the sociopath who is, wreaking all of this havoc. But on page 68, we have this description. It's not spoiling anything. We have a description of the sheriff and his wife coming across a flaming vehicle. And their reaction is so unexpected and so telling. You'll hear it when I read it to you. They parked a little way off and got out and stood looking at it. You could feel the heat on your face. Bell came around and opened the door and took his wife's hand. I mean, chivalry is not dead. Sheriff Bell is really a gem. She got out and stood with her arms folded in front of her. There was a pickup truck parked a ways down, and 2 men were standing there in the dull red glare. They nodded each in turn and said, "Sheriff." "We could have brought wieners," she said. "Yeah, marshmallows." I love this passage so much. I have a little heart written in the thing. I mean, this woman, first of all, he helps her out of the car and she stands with her arms crossed. The body language is not about the sheriff. It's about her strength. I mean, she's not cowering. She's not leaning into him. She's standing in a posture that's actually very kind of powerful and defensive. And then she makes this crazy joke that's like, "We should have brought wieners," which is so funny. And then when the sheriff responds and he says, "Yeah, marshmallows, and it's spelled ERS at the end, which speaks to the regional sense of the novel. But this is a book, this also qualifies, of course, as part of the dark humor. But this is a very spare little exchange of dialogue. There are no quotation marks, there are no em dashes. It's woven right in, but her voice is so distinct. Her name is Loretta. She's such a badass. I mean, really, honestly, in some ways, I feel like she could be the hero of the novel. And we don't see her very often, and she's not quoted very often. But this is such an incredible way to show us her strength and her cleverness and her relationship with her husband and her ease in all of this. It's just absolutely masterful the way that he is making the dialogue work, and that he is also revealing this minor character in this incredibly economical way. We are going to continue our discussion of these minor characters and how they are shown mostly through dialogue with this incredible encounter between two women. I'm not going to tell you much about them because you don't actually need to have any information. And also, I don't want to spoil it for anyone. So what's interesting here, and what you might pay attention to as I read, some of it is just simply the dialect, but also you end up with this sense that the older of the two women is this kind of oracular figure. She's kind of an oracle. In a book where women are kind of deceptively important, this is the oldest of the women. And it is so fascinating that we don't hear very much about her. The one time that we see her, it's maybe one full page of dialogue. But the sense that we get of her is so full, partly because of dialect, but also because of what Cormac McCarthy is having her say. Okay, so this is on page 201. They sat in the coffee shop surrounded by their bags and parcels and stared out at the rain and at the idling buses, at the gray day breaking. She looked at her mother. "Did you want some more coffee?" she said. The old woman didn't answer. "You ain't speaking, I reckon." "I don't know what there is to speak about." "Well, I don't guess I do either." "Whatever you all done, you done. I don't know why I ought to have to run from the law." "We ain't running from the law, Mama." "You couldn't call on 'em to help you, though, could you?" "Call on who?" "The law." "No, we couldn't." "That's what I thought." The old woman adjusted her teeth with her thumb and stared out the window. 3 years ago, she said, you didn't have to have no dream about it, no revelation nor nothing. I don't give myself no credit. Anybody could have told you the same thing. Well, I wasn't asking. The old woman shook her head, looking out through the window and down at the table they'd vacated. I give myself no credit, she said. I'd be the last in the world to do that. So there is so much happening here. Again, there's so many negatives. There are like triple negatives happening here. And all of that negativity is really coloring this interaction between them. We also, with this minor character, this idea of 3 years ago, that is an important time. And because she is speaking about it, and because she is this kind of oracular figure, you as the reader understand the importance of this event that happened 3 years before the events of the novel. Also, just the details that we have here. It's raining, which that is an example of pathetic fallacy, where nature is kind of, mirroring what is happening for the characters. We have them in this liminal space, which is liminal spaces are like anytime someone's in a hallway or a doorway, or anytime that they would be sort of moving through a space, an airport terminal, a bus station. These are places where you might see transformation, where often authors will have transformation occurring. And if there isn't any transformation that is occurring at that point, then that is also significant, because there's sort of a lack of transformation in a place that is meant to connote transformation. It's incredible the way that she looks at the table they had vacated. So that's an example of that kind of omniscient narrator's voice. The table they vacated is in pretty stark contrast with the dialogue that we hear from these two women. So we have that very adept mixing together of the dialogue of the people together with the words of the narrator, which gives you this huge span and allows all sorts of registers to be mixed together in this very effective way. But most importantly, this is an example of a minor character who is just extremely important in terms of underscoring all sorts of stuff that's happening in the novel. Okay, this is actually a very good segue. That scene was between Carla Jean, and it's actually her grandmother who is raising her, but she calls her Mama. We are now going to move from this minor character, which is the grandmother, to, in fact, one of the main characters, one of our protagonists. I would argue that Sheriff Bell is kind of the most important character, actually, in the novel. Importantly, we hear his voice in the first person, but I really think, a lot of people, the way that it is structured and the way that we see the action unfolding, a lot of people would I think very correctly, place Llewellyn Moss in that position of being the protagonist. Speaking of main characters, this is maybe a good time to interject a little bit about the names in the novel. Anyone who is a longtime Fox Page listener knows that I love it when writers do a very good job with their names. And obviously, Cormac McCarthy is someone who, this is yet another masterclass in how to name your characters. What I like about this is there's nothing kind of too over the top or too kind of on the nose. I'm interested in the fact that Llewellyn Moss, so Llewellyn is a Welsh name, and it's very clearly a Welsh name. Like it's kind of your archetypal one. It has a Y. At some point, there's another character whose last name has a Y in it in a way that makes it seem like it is from Welsh, heritage. And I think the importance of that, we talked a bit before about the way that the novel casts back into history. It's talking about the people who were making the pictographs, the native peoples. And so you have, I would argue, that same sort of casting back to the idea of the origins of a lot of American people, in this case from the British Isles and from Wales. Very importantly, Llewellyn means lion's mane, but it has everything to do with like courage and being a leader and standing up for things and having a lot of strength. So it's very, appropriate in many ways because this is a guy who does have a lot of courage and a lot of strength. I think he makes some crazy decisions at some points, but certainly he seems courageous. And as far as his last name, this idea of moss, so you have the idea of no moss is growing on a rolling stone, that kind of thing. We have the sense of moss as being soft, moss as actually being able to grow on all sorts of surfaces. We also have the Spanish word for moss, meaning more, which obviously it's spelled M-O-S-S, but you do have that connotation. There's quite a bit of Spanish in the book. So I think that thinking about him as more, that he is kind of more than just one character, he's more than just, he's obviously just one character, but we are meant to see him as being more, or maybe that he's supposed to be more and he's sort of stymied because of his circumstances. We then have Ed Tom Bell, which is so interesting. Edward is wealthy guardian, and you do have this idea, he's not wealthy, but you have this idea of him as really being a guardian. He's literally the sheriff. He's guarding, safeguarding, or at least trying to, his whole entire county. Thomas, interestingly, it can mean twin. And we do have, we have a couple of different sheriffs. In some ways, I think, Ed Tom Bell and Llewellyn Moss are definitely not twins, but you do have a lot of echoes of the two. Ed Tom had been in the Second World War. Llewellyn had been in Vietnam. Both of them were changed by their experiences in war. Both of them are very devoted to their wives. Both of them just kind of seem like good, humble, self-aware, self-effacing people who end up just like staring evil, like right in the eye. And then Bell, I think of Bell as kind of like sounding a bell, sounding sounding an alarm. We have the Liberty Bell. We have the idea of Bell as being beautiful. And even with Carla Jean, Carla is a feminized version of Charles, which means like strong, but also free, like a free person. And in many ways, Carla Jean is, fated from the beginning to not exactly be free. So all of that is to say that Cormac McCarthy, yet again, another masterclass this time in naming people. And I would underscore the fact that none of these is over the top. So that's actually a very good segue into this idea of why we are sympathetic, why we have so much sympathy for Llewellyn Moss. I think the confessional tone of and what we are hearing about the sheriff is producing a lot of sympathy and a lot of compassion for the sheriff's character. Llewellyn Moss, it's a bit different. We don't know very much about him. We know a lot about how he can handle a gun and how good a sniper he is. But you could argue, that his, essentially that it's sort of greed, that he takes this money, at the very beginning of the book, knowing that all sorts of terrible stuff is going to befall him. And, as the book moves along, he makes some choices that really endanger a lot of people. So there's this sense of like, why do we have so much sympathy for him? Literally at the bottom of one of the pages, like page 10, very early in the book, I was like, why do we love him so much? And I think part of it is there's this very quiet, very self-effacing thing. He says that point, like, don't get your dumbass shot out here. There's a sense of vulnerability that I think is very appealing. There's an adage in MFA programs that if you want a reader to love your character, you should show them your reader's faults, not their strengths, which I think is hugely effective and also like actually a very good description of what is happening here with Llewellyn Moss. And there are a couple of times I want to look at two distinct moments when when a lot of sympathy is generated for Llewellyn. And the first one has everything to do with poverty. This is a book that's not underscoring the poverty of these people or the fact that they don't have a lot of opportunity for work. It's set in 1980, which is interesting because it's very kind of timeless. I mean, there are no cell phones, so that's kind of a giveaway that it's not, in the 21st century. But it is clearly dated at 1980. And I don't know what was happening economically in Texas. He is a welder, Llewellyn Moss is, which is interesting. He's someone who's good at putting things together, even if it's difficult to do, and even if they're unwieldy and they're symbolically in terms of a job, it's very important. But we do get the sense, they live in a trailer, they meet at Walmart. I mean, these are people who you imagine have some financial struggles. So what we have on page 18 is this very important moment where I think McCarthy, in a very brief paragraph, very brief little chunk of text, really gives us the key to why it is that we should think it's okay that Llewellyn Moss decides to take this briefcase full of money. So here we have the section. He sat there looking at it, and then he closed the flap and sat with his head down. His whole life was sitting there in front of him, day after day, from dawn till dark until he was dead. All of it cooked down to 40 pounds of paper in a satchel. So you have this idea of the importance. He understands that this will absolutely change the course of his life. It is so cool to go back and look at this and realize that this is a very ambivalent point as far as McCarthy is concerned. I mean, he's saying like his entire life is in this briefcase. And at the beginning of the book, you are given the sense that, in fact, it might be a good thing. It might work out well for him. It might absolutely change the course of every single facet of his life in the best of ways. You also, however, know that there's a chance that it will not, in fact, do that. And also this very careful deliberation. He's got his head down. He's really trying to think through the right thing to do here. But I would argue that probably the way that we derive the most sympathy and the most sort of compassion for Llewellyn Moss is the depiction of him with his wife. So this is young Carla Jean. She's at the trailer. He's returning. It's very late at night. And what I love about this is the subtlety. So this is not like, this kind of like passionate love affair where it seems like this kind of idealized, unrealistic marriage. What we have here is actually something that feels very possible, but there's a huge amount of sort of dedication and love that you feel under this dialogue that is so well done. So here we have on page 20, he's been under the trailer hiding, I think, a gun under there, an H&K. Again, a very specialized sort of gun. He wedged the H&K up into a corner and pulled the insulation down over it and lay there thinking. Then he crawled back out with the case and dusted himself off and climbed the steps and went in. There again, we have that polysyndeton, that repetition of and. This is a very like McCarthy-esque kind of thing. And I think in some ways here and throughout, it is adding some sort of gravitas. There's like a real sense of the deliberate nature of all of these actions and the way that people are being very thoughtful about what they're doing. So we have, he crawled back out with the case and dusted himself off and climbed the steps and went in. She was sprawled across the sofa watching TV and drinking a Coke. She didn't even look up. 3 o'clock, she said. So just the fact that we have repeated she 3 different times, it would have been completely different if it was like Carla Jean was sprawled out. The she there is so intimate. The she means that we as the reader know who she is, which we don't yet know who she is. But there is like this assumption of intimacy that is so amazing. 3 o'clock, she said. I can come back later. Which I thought was so funny. I have a little ha in the thing. I mean, there's a lot of humor between the two of them, a lot of sort of banter that I really loved. She looked at him over the back of the sofa and looked at the television again. What have you got in that satchel? It's full of money. Yeah, that'll be the day. Which is also amazing because he's telling her the truth and she absolutely is not believing him. Which also is, underscoring the magnitude of what is happening to these people. He went into the kitchen and got a beer out of the refrigerator. Can I have the keys? She said. Where are you going? Get some cigarettes. Cigarettes. Yes, Llewellyn, cigarettes. I've been setting here all day. What about cyanide? How are we fixed for that? Now, this is incredible. So she's like, I want to go buy some cigarettes. And he essentially is like, what? Cigarettes are so dangerous, which is incredible. This quick, and he's not saying like you shouldn't be smoking. It's so artful. The way that he says, what about cyanide? How are we fixed for that? The reader has to work a little bit and be like, oh my gosh, he is equating cigarettes and cyanide, which also it even sounds great and it looks great on the page. We've got cigarettes and cyanide both beginning with C, but with the sibilant version of the C. It's on every level. This is just so well done. So we have this sense of him as being like really risk averse and someone who is, really doesn't want his wife smoking because of the effects on her health. It's absolute genius because we know that this is someone who is careful, someone who is thoughtful about the people in his life, and yet these large changes are coming. Then she continues. Just let me have the keys. I'll set out in the damn yard and smoke. He took a sip of the beer and went on back to the bedroom and dropped to one knee and shoved the case under the bed. Then he came back. I got you some cigarettes, he said. Let me get 'em. Which is so sweet. Then you're like, okay, he doesn't want her doing it and he wants to remind her that it's not good. But in this crazy day where we have seen all of these crazy things happen to him, we find out that at one point he was thinking about her and did this nice thing, even though he doesn't like it, because he knows that it will be appreciated by her. And honestly, I have a plan here that I was going to read the whole next page because the dialogue between them is so smart and it is so meaningful. But in the interest of time, and because I think you have already gotten a good sense of it, we're going to move on. So right next to all of this, concern about her health and cigarettes and whatnot, we have a paragraph that also generates a lot of sympathy. So on 23, we have this. He sat in the floor. I mean, in the floor, like that must be some sort of dialect. They must say that like in Texas or something. I felt like I was reading it wrong, but that was correct. He sat in the floor with the case between his legs and delved down into the bills and dredged them up. The packets were 20 deep. He shoved them back down into the case and jostled the case on the floor to level the money. Times 12. He could do the math in his head. 2.4 million. All used bills. He sat looking at it. You have to take this seriously, he said. You can't treat it like luck. So there is so much here. I mean, honestly, I think I was very impressed by the fact that he could do the math in his head and that he just like immediately comes up with a number. For some of you, that probably wasn't that impressive. But this is one of the ways, I mean, that isn't so much sympathy, that's kind of respect. We have respect for him as someone who can do math, who's intelligent. But we also we're getting a better sense of kind of the quandary here, this idea of all used bills. I mean, that's like that big crime thing. They're like unmarked bills and, you don't want new bills because all of this is a sort of criminal thing that is happening. And then this idea of you have to take it seriously, he said, you can't treat it like luck. We have this sense in the beginning, like he's making this decision to take and to keep and to use this money. Pardon the dogs. Sorry if you can hear that. But he's drawing this very clear distinction between just sort of like bumbling into this and thinking it's lucky and being much more deliberate and much more thoughtful, which also generates sympathy when he goes on to make a bunch of decisions that the reader sometimes is thinking maybe isn't the very best decision. Okay, we are going to look at these instances of dark humor in the book, and then we're going to look at one very short passage just to revel in the gorgeous nature of this prose. So interestingly, the book, according to my notes, got funnier toward the end, which I think makes some sense. I mean, partially because we need this comic relief. Like there are points that are so excruciating and so hard and heavy and dark that we really do need some kind of humor to leaven it. I also realized a lot of it is in dialogue, and that makes such good sense to me. Cormac McCarthy has the most incredible ear. His dialogue is doing such hard work, and oftentimes it is in dialogue because if you put humor into dialogue, you are enriching the characters and not just whatever is happening around. And again, is important when the darkness is somewhat unrelenting. There was a part that I didn't read where Llewellyn is talking to his wife, and there's one of those like, that's what she said things, which was so funny to me just because it seemed so modern, which, I mean, you could argue that maybe it's like a little anachronistic because this is supposed to be 1980. But I really loved it. And it was like in a scene that otherwise is kind of tense. But it speaks to the idea that these people, I don't know, it's like they're real survivors and they're in the middle of kind of difficult things, but they have a certain amount of like tenderness and a certain amount of warmth that allows them to be funny, even in these kind of dire situations. So we're going to look at page 106. And in some of these instances, I'm going to read like a little paragraph or something just so we can revel in the prose. And also to set it up, I keep saying this on these Fox Page lectures that lots of times when I'm trying to convey humor and read humor to you people, it falls like a little bit flat, which is unfortunate. And I think sometimes it's because the humor relies on a lot of the context and it sort of needs all of the interstitial stuff around it. But hopefully, but I keep trying because I really do think humor is difficult. And when someone does it well, I think it's interesting to look at why. Okay, so on page 106, Moss pulled into Eagle Pass at 1:45 in the morning. He'd slept a good part of the way in the back of the cab, and he only woke when they slowed coming off the highway and down Main Street. He watched the pale white globes of the street lamps pass along the upper rim of the window, then he sat up. "You going across the river?" the driver asked. "No, just take me downtown." "You are downtown." That was so funny to me. It's so dry and so just kind of curt in this way that is very effective. It also is doing, again, so much work. It's speaking to economic depression here. This is also pointing out something that is very important and I think actually has an echo in the title, which is that there's a lot of interplay between the United States and Mexico. I mean, not a lot, but when he goes into Mexico, you understand that some of these Mexican cartel, we are assuming that they're Mexican cartel drug runner people, they're not going to follow him because they're not going to be able to, easily cross the border the way that he can. It's very interesting the way that Mexico ends up feeling like a safe space and one that really speaks to the violence in the United States. Okay, so we're going to look at the next instance on 136. This is two law officers who are law officer. Is that right? Maybe, whatever. These are two officers discussing a crime scene. They walked up the stairs. The porch of the hotel was covered in glass and the woodwork shot up. The night clerk got killed. About as bad a piece of luck as you could have, I reckon. Caught a stray round. Where'd he catch it? Right between the eyes. Which, honestly, that is so dark that I can't believe I laughed at it. But it's such a funny, it's not funny, but it's so clever. It is funny. I do think that's funny. They're like, oh, he caught a stray round, which, you would think that that's something that you would be like grazed on the arm or whatever. Like, the whole point of that is that you are not meant to be shot. And then the fact that it was right between the eyes is a very good example of this kind of gallows humor. So the unexpected nature of that and also the humor is very important here to leaven and also to show us that this is something that these people are, used to seeing. This is not totally brand new. They're not in shock. They're talking about this in this way that makes you think that this is not all that unusual. Okay, this is on page 171. This was so impressive because essentially what is happening here is Cormac McCarthy is putting something that's like sort of funny, like you can definitely think of it as being funny, into the mind of the psychopath, which is like, it's so artful. So on page 171, we have this. This is Anton Sugar. I'm going to start a little further down so I don't spoil anything. I'm also going to change the names. He ruled out the man because he thought the man was almost certainly dead. That left the police, or some agent of the Matacumbe Petroleum Group, who must think that he thought that they thought that he thought that they were very dumb. He thought about that. It's already so funny, just the first part, like, who must think that he thought that they thought that he thought that they were very dumb. I didn't even try to follow all the back and forth. It also, though, speaks to the intelligence of this person, this total psychopath. And there's something about ending it with the word dumb. It's so understated that it is kind of humorous. So we have all of that convolution. And then we have this other sentence. He thought about that. It's genius. This is like Lori Moore. I love Lori Moore. We need to read some Lori Moore here on the Fox page. She is so funny. And she'll go all the way to the edge with this stuff that is so, so funny. And then she will go further. And it just gets funnier. So this is remarkable to me. Like the fact that this is our evil, villain, and yet we have this moment that you can't help but get some sort of levity from. The last thing we're going to look at is actually a perfect example of that kind of Lori Moore thing, or the kind of Cormac McCarthy thing that we just saw. It's interesting and important to remember that a lot of this stuff is all happening in dialogue. What's in that briefcase? Briefs. Which is so funny. I mean, you I think in the mouth of this person, you imagine he means underwear. I don't think that in the context of this, he means like legal briefs. So there's this funny, kind of play on words here. We have a little bit of that dad jokey kind of thing. So I'm gonna reread that and then read the second part. What's in that briefcase? Briefs? What's in it? I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. This crushed me. It crushed me. I mean, I think this is this line that people say all the time. I think it comes from James Bond. It's this like funny kind of cliche, but here it is so crazy and it is so smart to use it because literally like when people are getting embroiled all of this, their lives truly are on the line. So the way that he states it like this is so significant because it's actually kind of true. But then he's also using this line that puts people at ease and that a lot of people can relate to. It's just absolute genius humor. So before we close, before I read this last gorgeous passage, I want to just quickly like read through this list of all of these other aspects that I would have liked to have gone into, but that for the sake of time, we are not going to really explore deeply. The first is simply the way that he uses punctuation and spelling and syntax. You've heard a lot of fragments. A lot of the book is very fragmentary. A lot of it is unorthodox in terms of both punctuation and syntax. And we could spend, 2 hours talking just about that. We could have really dived deeply into the idea of the wars. We have someone from the First World War. We have someone from the Second World War. We have someone from Vietnam. The cataclysmic effect of those wars on the people, it's understated, it's subtle, but it is so important. And I believe that you could really map all of the ways in which war is its own kind of horror. In many ways, this idea of like this new evil and this new sort of brand of terrible reality that the sheriff is sort of staring down and lamenting, you can look at it in contrast and also as a continuation of the wars in a way that I think is really rich. There's a lot of philosophy in the novel, in some very actually kind of clearly spoken ways, and in some other ways that is not so clearly spoken. Questions about evil, of course, but also about fate and about will and about choosing like moral obligation. I mean, that's more of like an ethics question. But these strains of philosophy are absolutely there to be teased out. I've spoken actually quite a bit about wives, which I'm happy to have done, because they are this very important ballast. But the other way that I would want to talk about them is the fact that they create so much tension in a good way. I don't mean tension in the marriage. I mean that they make the stakes very, very high. So as soon as, you can imagine if Llewellyn Moss were just like his own dude, like an ex-Vietnam sniper that we were just kind of watching hunting antelope, we care far less about him than knowing that he has this young wife who he clearly loves and she loves him. You immediately have this sense of the stakes being much higher. Speaking of wives, it would be really interesting to very closely look at all of the parallels between Ed Tom and Loretta, his wife, the sheriff and his wife, and between Carla Jean and Llewellyn Moss. I mean, in some ways they're foils, they're very different, but in some ways they're very similar. They don't have children. They seem very devoted to each other. They have this kind of shorthand with which they speak. It would be very interesting. You could also talk a long time about time in the novel, clocks and calendars. There are a bunch of times where the exact time is mentioned, and you could, again, Cormac McCarthy is not going to do anything without it being significant. So you could go back and look at all the ways in which that exact time is informing a certain scene or even the entire novel. You could look at money, the times that money comes up and the significance of money. I mean, in some ways it undergirds the whole entire thing, but it would be so interesting to look because it's very subtle, and it would be cool to look at how that subtlety is actually functioning. And lastly, I really, this would be a much larger project, but there is, of course, the larger arc that we have here, which is this question of what's going to happen with Llewellyn Moss. But with any good piece of work, you're going to have this kind of larger arc. You're going to have, it's the old Freytag triangle. You're going to have the rising action. Well, you'll have your inciting incident. Then you'll have your rising action. You get up to the climax. Then you have, the falling action. And then you have your denouement, where some kind of new reality sets in or things sort of play out a little bit. But if you have a great book like this one, you have the main arc, and then you also have a bunch of smaller arcs. It's almost like we have these, we do have chapters, but we have these kinds of, in terms of geography and in terms of players, we have these different smaller arcs that would be very interesting to follow. So anyone out there who wants to write, some sort of paper, some sort of dissertation, oh my God, if anybody wants to write about any one of these things and share their thoughts with me, absolutely do that in the comments on YouTube. I love the comments on all the YouTube stuff. I mean, knock yourselves out. Somebody write a term paper. So we're going to finally move on to the very last part, which is where we are going to look at a tiny snippet of this prose just because it is so gorgeous. I mean, as if he weren't so good at all of the rest of these elements, he's also just incredibly good at description. So and oftentimes it's of the land in this way that is so beautiful. In the beginning of the novel, the word country comes up again and again and again. It's like this constant kind of refrain, just that word. But also the description of the country is so significant, which of course speaks to the title, but it is present too in a lot of Cormac McCarthy, certainly in the Border trilogy. So on page 118, we have this. He made his way up the street to a small park, or zocalo, where the grackles in the eucalyptus trees were waking and calling. The trees were painted white to the height of a wainscot, and from a distance, the park seemed set with white posts arrayed at random. In the center, a wrought iron gazebo or bandstand. He collapsed on one of the iron benches with the bag on the bench beside him and leaned forward holding himself. Globes of orange light hung from the lampstands, the world receding. Across from the park was a church. It seemed far away. The grackles creaked and swayed in the branches overhead, and day was coming. You guys, I'm so moved. I mean, it's actually so weird how description like this, and I'm not going to parse it for you. You can just, rewind and listen to it yourself, and you can pull out all of the important things that he's doing here. It is so incredible. So I'm going to leave it there. It seems very appropriate to just kind of leave you with his fiction because his prose is so, so beautiful. So I really hope that you have enjoyed this time, this like deep dive into why it is that Cormac McCarthy's work is so good. I think lots of people, go straight to kind of the plot and how he can make these really dark things so compelling and how he's not afraid to tackle all of these large questions in this way that feels unique. But I think everyone who reads him recognizes that the prose is unbelievably great. And it was so fun for me to really parse why it is that the prose does feel so good. So thank you so much for tuning in. Get out there and read some more Cormac McCarthy straight away. Happy reading.